All right, how is everyone doing today? Today we are going to look at chapter 17 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Oh, I haven't read. I haven't read from this book in almost a month, I think. So I don't remember exactly what we were doing. I don't remember where the story ended. But before we start, I just want to explain. I just want to explain after I clear my throat. I just want to explain that this is not a typical reading of David Copperfield, or this is not a typical audiobook, because this is for people who, well, it could be for several people. Mainly it's for people who are learning English and want to talk about vocabulary and the meanings of phrases and sentences. So I'm sorry, one second. I have this curse whenever I start a video. It always starts off horribly. Something goes wrong with the video, with the platform, or I can't talk. I don't know. Every single video. Okay. Well, so if you're watching this live with me, I really do want you to ask questions. If I don't explain a word, if there's a phrase that you don't understand, I really want you to ask in the chat. And if I see it, I will be happy to answer your questions for you. But I will be reading the book, and as I read, when I think there's an interesting word or phrase, I will stop and we will talk about it. If there's a strange word, maybe we'll look for a picture. So it's going to be a very slow process. It's not a typical reading. We will stop and talk about things as they happen. And actually, even in the title of the chapter, we come across an interesting phrasal verb. Somebody turns up. That phrasal verb, turn up, which I think I'm going to put up here. Let me just write this up. Let's say this is number 1. Means appear. It's a very common phrasal verb. And somebody turns up means somebody appears. So I guess the theme of this chapter will be that there's a surprise visit. Somebody is going to surprise David Copperfield. An old friend, maybe. Let's find out. Let's find out who turns up. Let's discover who turns up. It has not occurred to me to mention Peggotty since I ran away. Peggotty is a servant from the house where he grew up, and she was kind of like his grandmother, sort of like a grandmother to him. So after his mother died and his father-in-law sent him away to that horrible place in London, they kept in touch. They wrote to each other, and she's really kind of like a grandmother to him. When it says, it has not occurred to me to mention Peggotty, this phrase, it has not occurred to me, means I didn't think about it. So in plainer English, this is saying, I didn't think about mentioning Peggotty since I ran away. Because he was forced to work in this horrible place in London, and he decided to run away to see his aunt, to stay with his aunt. And so he hasn't thought about or mentioned Peggotty since he ran away from London. I wrote her a letter almost as soon as I was housed at Dover. That's where his aunt lives. So he ran away from London. He goes to stay with his aunt. And when he arrived there, he wrote her a letter. And another and a longer letter containing all particulars fully related, when my aunt took me formally under her protection. On my being settled at Dr. Strong's, I wrote to her again. So now the aunt has decided to take care of Davy. He's still a boy. I think he's about 10 or 11 years old. And she says, well, you have to go to school. So after spending some weeks or months with his aunt, she places him in a school, not very far away from where she lives. But now he's living, not at the school, but he's living near the school. Detailing my happy conditions and prospects. I never could have derived anything like the pleasure from spending the money Mr. Dick had given me. Mr. Dick is a kind of strange old man that lives with his aunt. To Peggotty, per post. When Davy was running away from London. Wait, how did that happen? Yeah, before Davy decided he was going to run away from London, but he didn't have very much money, so he wrote to Peggotty, and he said, "Please, could you send me a little bit of money?" Which she did. So she sent him some money, and then when he was going from London to Dover, immediately he was robbed. They took all of his money, so he had nothing, and he had to walk all the way from London to Dover, which took 1 week. So that's why he's saying that he sent her this half-guinea. That's money that he's sending to her. So because he wanted to repay the money that he borrowed from her. To discharge the sum that I had borrowed from her. In which epistle, not before, I mentioned about the young man and the donkey cart. Wait a minute. What is epistle? I've seen that word before, but I'm not exactly sure what it means. So this is a word for me too. I think it has something to do with religion. Wait, epistle. A letter. A poem. Yeah, a book of the New Testament. That's why I've heard that word before. It's another way of saying, I guess, a letter, but nobody would use that. It's not modern English. Oh, let's reread this. What did it say? So to be discharged from a debt means like to be forgiven of a debt. Like, I don't owe it to you anymore. So he says, I sent the half-guinea to Peggotty to be discharged from the debt, so that there was no more debt with her. That fixed the debt. In which epistle, of course, we don't use that word. In which letter? In the letter, not before, I mentioned about the young man with the donkey cart. So the young man with the donkey cart is the person who stole Davy's money and all of his belongings. So he was running away from London, and he thought, I can't carry this big chest with me. I can't carry all of my clothes. He's just a little boy. He's like 10 years old. So he saw a boy in the street with a donkey and a cart, and he said, how much to take me to, let's say, the bus. It's not a bus because it's 200 years ago, but the 200-year-old version of a bus, a coach. But instead of the boy taking him to the bus, he just took his money and his things and ran off with his donkey. Left Davy standing there in the street with nothing. And he explained that to Peggotty, the man with the donkey cart. Okay, let's see. These communications, Peggotty replied as promptly, that means quickly, if not as concisely as a merchant's clerk. Her utmost powers of expression, which were certainly not great in ink, were exhausted in the attempt to write that she felt on the subject of my journey. What she felt on the subject of my journey. So Peggotty is a very simple woman. She's a servant. She was a servant in the house where Davy grew up. So she's not very good at communicating or talking. And that's what Davy's saying here. It was not easy for her to express her feelings in the letter, because imagine she's not very good at expressing herself speaking. So imagine writing. Four sides of incoherent and interjectional beginnings of sentences. Incoherent means you can't understand it. So she's writing, but he can't really understand what she's saying. Maybe because of the style of her handwriting, but also maybe because she's not communicating herself very well. An interjection is, they're usually words like, oh my gosh. That's an interjection, or oh no, or oh my. These are interjections. So the letter was 4 pages of incoherent startings of sentences and interjections like my goodness, oh my, that had no end except blots. A blot is, let me just show you a picture of a blot. A blot is like an unorganized shape. This is a blot. So if you're writing, especially with an old pen, the ink maybe would make this kind of thing on the paper. Or if you're crying, she was probably crying, and then the tears on the paper mixed with the ink, and then it was difficult to read what was saying, what she was writing. All right. Four sides of incoherent and interjectional beginnings of sentences that had no end, except blots, were inadequate to afford her any relief. But the blots were more expressive to me than her composition. So the blots were because she was crying. Davy was telling her this very sad story, and she's not educated enough to express her feelings in the letter. But also she's crying, and the tears are going onto the paper, and it's making it difficult to read what she's writing. And he's saying, I couldn't understand the words, but I could feel her emotions because of all of these blots on the paper. Four sides of incoherent and interjectional beginnings of sentences that had no end, except blots, were inadequate to afford her any relief, but the blots were more expressive to me than the best composition. The best style of writing. For they showed me that Peggotty had been crying all over the paper, and what could I have desired more? He obviously doesn't want her crying, but it makes him feel good that she loves him. I made out with much difficulty that she could not take quite kindly to my aunt yet. Okay, I want to put this phrasal verb to make out. The phrasal verbs always mean more than one thing. And we have this phrasal verb to make out. I want to add a number here. I think this is number 2. Means to distinguish, to make clear. So imagine Davy's trying to read this letter written by Peggotty. She probably cannot write well. She doesn't know how to express herself well. So it's difficult to understand the words that she's writing. Plus, she's crying, so everything that she writes is not clear. He just has this very difficult to read paper. Maybe he can understand a word here, a word here, a word here. So he made out, like he was able to distinguish, able to understand, able to make clear, able to see with difficulty that she could not take quite kindly to my aunt yet. So Peggotty only met Davy's aunt on the night when he was born. This book begins on the night that David was born. And David's mother was a widow. that means that her husband was dead. And she was very young. So she was this very young woman, and she was having a baby with no husband, and she was very scared. And that night, the aunt came. Really David's father's aunt came to the house. And she's a very difficult woman. And she came to the house and she said, "You're going to have a girl." And she was convinced, the aunt was convinced that she was going to have a girl. And when David was born, she was extremely angry that he was a boy, and she left. And she never saw him again. Peggotty never saw her again. Davy never saw her again until he ran away to her. So Peggotty still doesn't like the aunt, because all she remembers is that one evening when Davy was born, and what a difficult woman that she was. And so Davy couldn't understand the letter, but one thing he could understand was, "I still don't like your aunt. I don't like your aunt," because she remembers that time. I made out with much difficulty that she could not take quite kindly to my aunt yet. The notice was too short after so long a prepossession the other way. "We never knew a person," she wrote, "but to think that Miss Betsy," that's his aunt, "should seem to be so different from what she had thought she would be, was immoral." So Davy is saying, well, this is complicated, actually. Wait, let's read that again. "We never knew a person," she wrote, "but to think that Miss Betsy should seem to be so different from what she had thought to be." So Peggotty is saying, I can't like her. I'm happy that she took you, that she adopted you, but I can't like her because I remember her that night, and that's the kind of person that she is, the kind of person I saw that night. How could she be any different from that? That was her word. It was immoral. She was evidently still afraid of Miss Betsy, for she sent her grateful duty to her timidly. So even though Peggotty is afraid of the aunt, I think what that means is that she said, "Tell her I said hello." So she's still afraid of her. She doesn't like her, but she still gives her respect because she's higher up. And she was evidently afraid of me. She was evidently afraid of me, too, and entertained the probability of my running away soon, if I might judge from the repeated hints she threw out that the coach fare to Yarmouth was always to be had for her, of her for the asking. So Peggotty doesn't even believe that David likes the aunt. The aunt turns out to be a very nice woman. She's just difficult. But Peggotty is saying, Peggotty doesn't believe that Davy is happy. And she's saying, well, if you need to come to me, just write to me and I will send you the money and you can come. She gave me one piece of intelligence which affected me very much, namely, that there had been a sale of the furniture at our old home. So Davy's mother dies, and now Davy is in the people in charge of Davy are his stepfather and his mean sister. And his stepfather sent him to London, to this horrible place where he was very unhappy. And that's why he ran away to the aunt. And then I think in chapter 13 or 14, he runs away from London to the aunt. The aunt decides to adopt him. But first, she writes to the father-in-law. She says, hey, Davy ran away from London and he's here with me. What do you want me to do? And the stepfather immediately came the next day, or in 2 days, came. And he said, give me the boy. And the aunt was thinking, no, because she could see that he's a horrible person. He and his sister are really horrible. And she says, no, I'm not giving you the boy. Are you crazy? And he said, and then he disowned David. He said, okay, from this moment, he's yours. I will not help him. I will not do anything for him. He's yours. Take him. And now Peggotty is writing to Davy saying they're selling the house. So that's kind of interesting. So the house where Davy was born and grew up, the stepfather, the evil stepfather, is selling the house. She gave me one piece of intelligence which affected me very much, which gave me a lot of feeling. Namely, that there had been a sale of furniture at our old home, and that Mr. and Miss Murdston, that's the stepfather and the evil sister, were gone away, and the house was shut up. The house being shut up means it was closed because nobody is going to live there for a long time. That's what that means. So that kind of implies that they're going away and not coming, maybe never coming back. To let or to be sold. To let means to rent. So they're either going to rent the house or sell the house. God knows I had no part in it while they remained there, but it pained me to think of the dear old place as altogether abandoned, of the weeds growing tall in the garden, and the tall leaves lying thick and wet upon the paths. I imagined how the winds of winter would howl around it. Howl, that's the sound of a dog or a wolf, like "ow." But we use that also for the wind. So when the wind makes that sound like whoosh, or sometimes it does howl, it makes a whoo sound. That's the sound of the wind howling. That's also the sound of a dog or a wolf. Oh, okay. Enough of that. How the cold rain would beat upon the window glass. How the moon would make the ghosts on the walls of the empty rooms watching their solitude all night. I thought afresh of the grave in the churchyard underneath the tree, and it seemed as if the house were dead too. Now, and all connected with my father and mother were faded away. Oh, I should read that again. The right way. And I thought afresh of the grave in the churchyard underneath the tree, and it seemed as if the house were dead too now, and all connected with my father and mother were faded away. So the selling of the house and the selling of the furniture, it was like Davy's last connection to his real mother and real father. And so that was very painful for him. There was no other news in Peggotty's letters. Mr. Barkis, that's Peggotty's new husband, was an excellent husband, she said, though still a little near. But we all had our faults. I think what that means is he was cheap, because Mr. Barkis, in previous chapters, seems to be a very cheap guy. He doesn't like to spend money. I think that's another way of saying that. Well, we all have our faults. And she had plenty, though I'm not sure, I don't know what they were. And he said his duty, and my little bedroom, and he sent his duty, meaning he said hello, he sent his greetings. And my little bedroom was always ready for me. Mr. Peggotty as well, and Ham was well, and Mrs. Gummidge. These are Peggotty's family. Peggotty's brother, Mr. Peggotty. Ham, I'm not sure who Ham is. I guess he's like Mr. Peggotty is a fisherman, and I think Ham is also a fisherman, but they're very close. And Mrs. Gummidge is an old widow, a very sad old widow who lives with them. And Mrs. Gummidge was but poorly. She's always depressed and sad. That's why it says she was poorly. She's never happy. She's always crying and sad because she's a sad widow. And little Emily wouldn't send her love, but said that Peggotty might send it if she liked. So Emily and Davy have this kind of boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, but they're very young. They're around 10 years old. So it's kind of a love-hate relationship. So she said, I'm not sending my love, but you can send it if you want, Peggotty. Like that. All this intelligence I dutifully imparted to my aunt, only reserving to myself the mention of little Emily, to whom I instinctively felt that she would not very tenderly incline. So Davy told her everything in the letter from Peggotty, except he didn't mention Emily, because he was afraid that his aunt would disapprove. While I was yet new at Dr. Strong's, she made several excursions over to Canterbury to see me, and always at unseasonable hours, with the view, I suppose, of taking me by surprise, but finding me well employed, and bearing a good character, and hearing on all hands that I rose fast in the school, she soon discontinued the visits. So the aunt, who didn't live very far away, but far enough that it was inconvenient to visit, sometimes she would come and visit him at very strange hours, just by surprise, just to see, is he being good? And after she saw many times that he was always being very good, she stopped visiting so much. She stopped doing that. I saw her on Saturday every third or fourth week, when I went over to Dover for a treat, and I saw Mr. Dick every alternate Wednesday when he arrived by stagecoach at noon, to stay until the next morning. On these occasions, Mr. Dick never traveled without a leathern writing desk, containing a supply of stationery and the memorial, in relation to which document he had a notion that time was beginning to press now, and that it really must be got out of hand. Mr. Dick was very partial to gingerbread. To render his visits more agreeable, my aunt had instructed me to open a credit for him at the cake shop, which was hampered with the stipulation that he should not be served with more than 1 shilling's worth in the course of any one day. So Mr. Dick, there's something, he's a little slow, he's a little bit crazy, and so even though Davy is 10, the aunt is telling him, okay, when he visits, get him some gingerbread, but only a little, don't let him eat too much. So Davy was in charge of making sure that he didn't eat too much gingerbread, even though he's an old man. This and the reference of all his little bills, and at the county inn where he slept, to my aunt before they were paid, induced me to suspect that he was only allowed to rattle his money and not spend it. When Davy first met Mr. Dick, he noticed that Mr. Dick always had some money in his pockets. And this word rattle, can you hear that? You know, that's the sound of like coins in your pocket. That's rattling your coins. He was always doing that with his money, rattling them. So Davy noticed that about him when he first met Mr. Dick. And now he's observing, oh, Mr. Dick has money, but I guess it's just to make noise because it seems like his aunt is in charge of all the money. So he's just allowed to rattle the money. He's not allowed to spend it. Okay, I found on further investigation that this was so that was true. His aunt was really in charge of his money. Or at least there was an agreement between him and my aunt that he should account for all of his disbursements. As he had no idea of deceiving her and always desired to please her, he was thus made chary of launching into expenses. On this point, as well on all other possible points, Mr. Dick was convinced that my aunt was the wisest, most wonderful woman, as he repeatedly told me with infinite secrecy and always in a whisper. So Mr. Dick used to say, "She's the most wonderful woman," like that. Mr. Dick nodded. This is nodding. Mr. Dick nodded. "I thought nothing would have frightened her," he said, "for she's," he whispered softly, "don't mention it, the wisest and most wonderful woman." Having said which, he drew back to observe the effect of this description of her made upon me. So he would say, "She's the most wonderful and wisest woman." What do you think about that? First time he came, said Mr. Dick, was the first time he came, said Mr. Dick, was, let me see, 1649 was the date of King Charles' execution. I think you said 1649. Yes, sir. Mr. Dick is obsessed with King Charles. And he's always trying to write, I forget what he's trying to write about, but he's always trying to write something, and then King Charles comes into his head, and he starts writing about that, and he can't stop. He gets obsessed with it. I don't know how it can be, said Mr. Dick, sorely puzzled, and shaking his head. I don't think I'm as old as that. Was it in that year that the man appeared, sir? I asked. Why, really, said Mr. Dick, I don't see how it can have been in that year, Trotwood. Did you get the date out of history? Yes, sir. I suppose history never lies, does it? Said Mr. Dick, with a gleam of hope. Oh dear, no, sir, I replied, most decisively. I was ingenuous and young, and I thought so. Even when I'm reading that, because Mr. Dick says history doesn't lie, and Davy says, oh, no, it doesn't. And I'm thinking in my head when I'm reading that, of course it does. It always does. And even here, he says, I was young and ingenuous, and I thought so. So he really believed that when he said it. But now that he's older, he knows that's not true. History always lies. I can't make it out, said Mr. Dick, shaking his head. There's something wrong somewhere. However, it was very soon after the mistake was made of putting some of the trouble out of King Charles's head into my head that the man first came. I was walking out with Miss Trotwood after tea, just at dark, and there he was, close to our house. Walking about? Inquired I. So walking, that's going from like point A to point B, walking from your house to the park. Walking about means walking, but maybe you're not going anywhere. You're just walking here, walking there, walking there. Mr. Dick is describing that there was some strange man walking about the house. So he was outside of Betsy Trotwood's house, the place where they live, where Mr. Dick lives, just walking. Not going anywhere. Which is, if you see somebody doing that in front of your house, that's kind of uncomfortable, a little bit scary. Walking about? I inquired. Walking about, Mr. Dick. Let me see, repeated Mr. Dick. Let me see. I must recollect a bit. No. He was not walking about. I asked, as the shortest way to get at it. What he was doing. Oh, what he was doing? Well, he wasn't there at all, said Mr. Dick, until he came up behind her and whispered. Then she turned around and fainted. Fainting is, losing consciousness. So what he's saying is there was a strange man, and at first Mr. Dick thought he was walking about, walking here, walking there, in front of the house, around the house. And then he says, no, he wasn't walking about. Betsy Trotwood was standing there, and he came from behind, and he whispered into her ear, and she turned around and fell to the ground. And I stood still and looked at him, and he walked away. But that he should have been hiding ever since in the ground or somewhere. It's the most extraordinary thing. Has he been hiding ever since? I asked. To be sure, retorted Mr. Dick, nodding his head gravely, never came out till last night. We were walking. Last night he came up behind her again. I knew him again. And did he frighten my aunt again? All of a shiver. A shiver is, ooh, that's a shiver, said Mr. Dick, counterfeiting that affection, making his teeth chatter. Ooh. Held by the palings, cried. Held by the palings. What is a paling? Let's take a look. Palings. A fence made from long, thin pieces of wood. Oh, let's see if we can find a picture of that. Oh. Well, I didn't know that's what that was called. These are palings here. Palings. These are the long pieces of wood going up and down on the fence. I never knew that was the name for them. So she fell back, held by the paling. So she fell, but the fence kept her from going to the ground, I guess. We'll see in a minute. Let's read that from the beginning. All of a shiver, said Mr. Dick, counterfeiting that affection and making his teeth chattering. So counterfeiting means like faking or imitating here. So when he said all of a shiver, he did that, what I'm doing now. Making his teeth chatter. Chattering teeth are like this. Oh, wait, let's see if I can find a chattering teeth gif, because I can't do it anyway. Just so you understand, it's kind of what happens if you have like if you're cold, you do this with your teeth. Maybe these are chattering teeth, like that. Held by the palings, so the fence was holding her up. Trotwood, but Trotwood, come here, getting me close to him, that he might whisper very softly, why did she give him money, boy, in the moonlight? He was a beggar, perhaps. Mr. Dick shook his head, as utterly renouncing the suggestion, and having replied a great many times, and with great confidence, no beggar, no beggar, no beggar, sir, went on to say that from his window he had afterwards, and late at night, seen my aunt give this person money outside the garden rails in the moonlight, who then slunk away. Slinking away is like this. That's slinking away. Slink, slink, slunk. I guess it could be slink, slunk, slunk, but I think I would say slunk. I guess it's slunk. He slunk away. That's slinking away. So she gave him money, and then he looked around and slunk away. Should I put that as one of my things? I'll make like a little exercise with slink away. That's very unusual. Not uncommon, but I guess it's not something that you learn every day in an English class. Slink away. Slinking away. Okay. Where did we go? Into the ground again, and he thought probable, and was seen no more, while my aunt came hurriedly and secretly back into the house, and had, even that morning, been quite different from her usual self, which preyed on Mr. Dick's mind. I had not the least belief in the outset of this story. So this sounds like a very crazy story. And Mr. Dick, he's a little crazy. So Davy is taking him seriously, asking him questions, but really, even a 10-year-old boy knows that this is crazy and it can't be true. I had not the least belief in the outset of this story that the unknown was anything but a delusion of Mr. Dick's. And one of the line of that ill-fated prince who occasioned him so much difficulty. But after some reflection, I began to entertain the question whether an attempt, or a threat of an attempt, might have been twice made to take poor Mr. Dick himself from under my aunt's protection, and whether my aunt, the strength of whose kind feeling towards him I knew from herself, might have been induced to pay a price for his peace and quiet. Now, Mr. Dick, he's a little bit strange, he's a little bit crazy, and he was living with his family, and they wanted to put him away in an institution. But Betsy Trotwood, Davy's aunt, said, no, he can stay with me. I want him to stay with me. I will be responsible for him. He's a good person. And now Davy is thinking, well, obviously that story is crazy that Mr. Dick is telling. But maybe what really happened was maybe the family or somebody was saying, no, we're going to take him and put him in the hospital unless you give us some money. So that's what Davy is thinking. Maybe it's real, but it's not what Mr. Dick thinks. As I was already much attached to Mr. Dick and very solicitous for his welfare, my fears favored this supposition, and for a long time his Wednesday hardly ever came around without my entertaining the misgiving that he would not be on the coach box as usual. So that really worried Davy, that what was actually happening was that maybe somebody was trying to take Mr. Dick and put him in an institution. And he really liked Mr. Dick. And when he would go to meet him on his visits, he was always afraid when the coach arrived that Mr. Dick would not be there. There he always appeared, however, gray-headed, laughing and happy, and he never had anything more to tell of the man who could frighten my aunt. These Wednesdays were the happiest days of Mr. Dick's life. They were far from being the least happy of mine. He soon became known to every boy in the school, and though he never took an active part in any game but kite flying, was as deeply interested in all of our sports as anyone among us. How often have I seen him attent upon a match at marbles or peg-top, looking on with a face of unutterable interest. Utter is kind of like talk. It's like making noise with your mouth, saying something with your mouth. So unutterable means I can't say it, I can't express it. Unutterable interest. So interest I can't explain to you. And hardly breathing at the critical times. How often hare and hounds, a hare is a kind of rabbit, and a hound is a dog, have I seen him mounted on a little knoll, cheering the whole field on to action, and waving his hat above his grey head, oblivious of King Charles the martyr's head, and all belonging to it. How many a summer hour have I known to be but blissful minutes to him. And let me read that again. That's how many a summer hour have I known to be but blissful minutes. Blissful means extremely happy. So how many hours have I experienced with him that were just so wonderful, so happy? In the cricket field, How many winter days have I seen him standing blue-nosed in the snow and east wind, looking at the boys going down the long slide and clapping his worsted gloves in rapture. He was a universal favorite, and his ingenuity in little things was transcendent. He could cut oranges into such devices as none of us had any idea of. He could make a boat out of anything, from a skewer upwards. He could turn cramp bones into chessmen. What's a cramp bone? Let's see what a cramp bone is. Oh, I don't know. It doesn't. I can't find any pictures of a cramp bone. I guess that's just a really old term. It doesn't really mean anything now, as far as I can see. Okay, he could turn cramp bone. Well, what if I put a dash? I didn't put a dash. Cramp bones. No, still same thing. Cramp bone is a patella of a sheep formerly used as a charm. What is cramp bone? Patella. What is a patella of a sheep? Okay, let's see if I do patella of a sheep. If I get a picture. I guess a patella is some kind of bone. Okay, according to this picture, it's just some part of a sheep, I guess. So it's this, whatever. It's not really that important. Okay, but now we know what a cramp bone is, all of us. So let's see. He could turn cramp bones into chessmen, fashion Roman chariots from old court cards, make spoked wheels out of cotton reels, and bird cages out of old wire. But he was greatest of all, perhaps, in the articles of string and straw, with which we were all persuaded he could do anything that could be done by hands. So if he had some string and some straw, that's like a long piece of grass, dry grass, he could do anything with that. Mr. Dick's renown. That's like fame. Renown is like fame. Mr. Dick's fame. Mr. Dick's renown was not long confined to us. After a few Wednesdays, Dr. Strong himself made some inquiries of me about him, and I told him all my aunt had told me, which interested the doctor so much that he requested on the occasion of his next visit to be presented to him. So Dr. Strong, the owner of the school, wanted to meet Mr. Dick and asked Davy, the next time Mr. Dick comes, introduce us. This ceremony I performed, and the doctor begging Mr. Dick, whensoever he should not find me at the coach's office, to come on there and rest himself until our morning's work was over. It soon passed into a custom for Mr. Dick to come on as a matter of course. So if Davy couldn't meet Mr. Dick when he arrived in town, Dr. Strong invited Mr. Dick to come to his place and stay there and wait for Davy. And that became something that happened all the time. Mr. Dick was always going to Dr. Strong's. And if we were a little late, as often happened on a Wednesday, to walk about the courtyard waiting for me, here he made the acquaintance of the doctor's beautiful young wife, paler than formerly, all this time, more rarely seen by me, or anyone, I think, and not so gay, but not less beautiful. So paler. Now, in a previous, Dr. Strong is a very nice older man, very nice, very generous man, and he married a very young, very, very young, beautiful woman. And it seems like she was having an affair with someone. And when people discovered this affair, they made the man go away. They sent him away to India to be a soldier, work in a company or something. I don't know. But since then, she's been very depressed because that was really her lover. So now he's saying she's still beautiful, but now she's paler, meaning whiter, like there's no color in her face. The color is gone from her face. Dr. Strong doesn't know about the affair. He's a very innocent person, but people around him knew. So he doesn't know anything about that. So she looks paler, and she rarely seen by me or anyone. So nobody ever sees her. She never goes out because she's depressed. And not so gay. Gay just means happy. So not so happy anymore. But not less beautiful. She's still very beautiful, but she doesn't look as happy, or there's no color in her face anymore. And so became more and more familiar by degrees, until at last he would come into the school and wait. He always sat in a particular corner, on a particular stool, which he called Dick after him, which was called Dick after him. Here he would sit, with his gray head bent forward, attentively listening to whatever might be going on, with a profound veneration for the learning he had never been able to acquire. Veneration means like respect. So he would be sitting there in the classroom listening while the children were having their lessons. And you could see that he was very respectful and very interested in what the teacher was doing. This veneration, this respect, Mr. Dick extended to the doctor, whom he thought the most subtle and accomplished philosopher of any age. So Mr. Dick really admired Dr. Strong. He thought he was an amazing person. It was long before Mr. Dick ever spoke to him otherwise than bareheaded. So when people used to always wear hats as a sign of respect, if you were talking to someone more important to you, you would probably take off your hat. And Davy is saying it was a very long time. It was a very long time before Mr. Dick felt comfortable leaving his hat on his head. So every time Dr. Strong came, Mr. Dick would remove his hat out of respect. But I guess after a long time, he started feeling more comfortable and stopped doing that. Bareheaded means nothing on your head, naked head. So it was a long time before Mr. Dick ever spoke to him other than bareheaded. So Mr. Dick always removed his hat when he talked to Dr. Strong for respect. Even when he and the doctor had struck up quite a friendship. They became very good friends, but Mr. Dick would still remove his hat because he thought that Dr. Strong was such an amazing philosopher and would walk together by the hour. On that side of the courtyard, which was known among us as the Doctor's Walk, Mr. Dick would pull off his hat at intervals to show his respect for wisdom and knowledge. How it ever came about that the doctor began to read out scraps of the famous dictionary in these walks, I never knew. Perhaps he felt it all the same at first, as reading to himself. So Dr. Strong is trying to write his own dictionary. And it's kind of an obsession of his. And Mr. Dick, I guess, probably he has the kind of personality, he would be very fascinated by that. Nobody cares about Dr. Strong's dictionary. He's always trying to talk about words and word origins, and nobody is interested. But Mr. Dick loves it. So they're the perfect friends. Dr. Strong, so they walk in the courtyard back and forth, and Dr. Strong talks about his dictionary. However, it passed into custom too, and Mr. Dick, listening with a face shining with pride and pleasure in his heart of hearts, believed the dictionary to be the most delightful book in the world. As I think of them going up and down before those schoolroom windows, the doctor reading with his complacent smile, an occasional flourish of manuscript, that means like, a big movement of the manuscript. So he's got the manuscript, the papers of the dictionary, and sometimes he would turn a big page as they were talking. That's the flourish of a manuscript, or a grave motion of the head. And Mr. Dick listening, enchained by interest, with his poor wits calmly wandering God knows where, upon the wings of hard words. I think of it as one of the pleasantest things in a quiet way that I've ever seen. I feel as if they might go walking to and fro. That means back and forth like this. To and fro. To and fro. That's a common phrase, walking to and fro. That means going this way and then going that way. To and fro forever. And for the world might somehow be better for it, as if 1,000 things it makes a noise about were not one half so good for it or me. Agnes was one of Mr. Dick's friends very soon, and in often coming to the house, he made acquaintance with Uriah. The friendship between himself and me increased continually, and it was maintained on this odd footing that while Mr. Dick came professedly to look after me as my guardian, he always consulted me in any little matter of doubt that arose, and invariably guided himself by my advice, not only having high respect for my native sagacity, we have to look up that word, but considering that I inherited a good deal from my aunt. So when Davy came to stay with his aunt, and she made the decision to adopt Davy. She even changed his name. Her name is Betsy Trotwood, and she changed his name to Trotwood. So she just calls him Trotwood or Trot. On that day when she decided to be his guardian, to look after him, she said, "And Mr. Dick will be like my equal partner. He will also be your official guardian." So Mr. Dick is Davy's guardian. But it's funny because, Mr. Dick is a little bit strange, and he comes and visits Davy every Wednesday. And although Mr. Dick is supposed to be Davy's guardian in charge of him, he's always asking Davy for advice. And he takes it. He listens to Davy. Whatever Davy tells him to do, he does. Because he thinks that Davy's really smart, even though he's just a 10-year-old boy. But also, he thinks he must have some of the wisdom of his aunt. On Thursday morning, when I was about to walk with Mr. Dick from the hotel to the coach office before going back to school, so the coach, that's like the bus for horses. So going to the coach office is like going to the bus station so that Mr. Dick can go home. On Thursday morning, when I was about to walk with Mr. Dick from the hotel to the coach office before going back to school, for we had an hour's school before breakfast, I met Uriah in the street, who reminded me of the promise that I had made to take tea with himself and his mother, adding with a writhe. A writhe is a movement like this. Adding with a writhe. "But I think I didn't expect you to keep it, Master Copperfield. We're so very humble." So Uriah is a very creepy person. And I think that because a writhe is like the movement of a snake. That's how a snake moves. And I think it's on purpose that they use that word writhe when talking about Uriah, because he is like a snake. He's a very snaky person. I really had not yet been able to make up my mind whether I liked Uriah or detested him. Detest is another way of saying hate. Maybe we'll put that up here. We haven't put a lot of vocabulary words up here today, so we'll put detest. Detest means hate. So Davy says, I don't know. I don't know if I like Uriah or I detest him or I hate him. I really had not yet been able to make up my mind whether I liked Uriah or detested him, and I was very doubtful about it still, as I stood looking at him in the face in the street, but I felt it quite an affront to be supposed proud, and said I only wanted to be asked. Wait, I think I missed something. Let's see. I'm just going to go back and read this for a minute. One Thursday morning, when I was about to walk with Mr. Dick from the hotel to the coach office before going back to school, for we had an hour's school before breakfast, I met Uriah in the street, who reminded me of the promise I had made to take tea with him, with himself and his mother, with a writhe. Well, I think when Davy was talking to Uriah earlier, Uriah invited Davy to have tea with them at his home. And I'm not sure how this happened, but Davy either reminded him or accepted the invitation when he saw Uriah in the street at that moment. And Uriah was very surprised that Davy said, sure, I'll come to your house and have tea. And Uriah said, oh, I didn't think that you would actually do it because me and my mother, we're so humble. The word is humble, like we're very simple. He says humble because he doesn't pronounce the H in humble. But he says, I didn't think that you would accept the invitation because we're such simple, poor people. And Davy kind of was insulted by that. Like, what? Okay, let's see. Oh, if that's all, Mr. Copperfield, said Uriah, and it really isn't our humbleness that prevents you, will you come this evening? But if it's our humbleness, I hope you won't mind owning it, Mr. Copperfield, for we are well aware of our condition. So he's saying, I guess what happened was, I'm not sure how that situation played out, but something happened where maybe Uriah said, well, are you coming to tea ever? I thought you said you were coming to tea. And Davy said, well, I was kind of waiting for you to invite me, like officially. And then Uriah said, I didn't really want to invite you officially because I thought you would say no, because we're so simple and poor. And Davy said, no, I just wanted to be invited. And then Uriah says, well, oh, if that's the only reason, yes, will you come tonight? But if you're not being honest, if you're just being nice right now, you have to tell us. I understand because we're so poor and so simple that you wouldn't want to visit with us. But just be honest. That's what he's saying. Okay. Let's see. Let's read that again. So, oh, if that's all, Mr. Copperfield, said Uriah, and it really isn't our humbleness, it isn't that we're very simple and poor that prevents you from coming to tea, will you come this evening? But if it is our humbleness, if you don't want to come because we're so simple and so poor, I hope you won't mind owning to it, Mr. Copperfield. If you really don't want to come because we're so poor and simple, please just say so. Please just be honest with me. For we are well aware of our condition. We know that we're very simple and poor. That's kind of the annoying thing about Uriah Heep, is that he's always talking about how simple and poor and humble he is. If you go around saying you're humble all the time, you're really not humble, are you? I said I would mention it to Mr. Wickfield. That's the place where he's staying. That's the man who owns the house where he's staying. And if he approved, that's also Uriah's boss. And if he approved, as I had no doubt he would, I would come with pleasure. So, at 6 o'clock that evening, which was one of the early office evenings, I announced myself as ready to Uriah. Mother will be proud indeed, he said, as we walked away together. Or she would be proud if it wasn't sinful, Master Copperfield. So because proud is the opposite of humble. If you're humble, you're not proud. And so he says mother would be so proud to have you if it wasn't sinful to be proud. Yet you didn't mind supposing I was proud this morning, I returned. So now Davy is saying, oh, but you're always calling me proud, so what do you think about me? Yet you didn't mind supposing I was proud this morning, I returned. Oh dear, no, Master Copperfield, returned Uriah. Oh, believe me, no, such a thought never came into my head. I shouldn't have deemed it at all proud if you had thought us too humble for you, because we are so very humble. Have you been studying much law lately? I asked, to change the subject. Oh, Master Copperfield, he said, with an air of self-denial, my reading is hardly to be called study. I have passed an hour or two in the evening, sometimes with Mr. Tidd. Rather hard, I suppose, said I. He is hard to me sometimes, returned Uriah, but I don't know what he might be to a gifted person. So he's saying, yes, it is difficult to read with Mr. Tidd. He's very difficult with me, but if I were a smarter person, maybe it would be different. Or maybe it would be the same. After beating a little tune on his chin as he walked on, so I guess that means like this, with 2 forefingers of his skeleton right hand, he added, there are expressions, you see, Master Copperfield, Latin words and terms in Mr. Tidd that are trying to a reader of my humble attainments. Let's put the word trying here. I think we're on number 4. Trying here, I mean, I think you know trying means attempting to do something, but trying can also mean difficult. So sometimes when you say that something is trying, I have a very trying job. That means I have a very difficult job. That's a way that you can use this word trying. And that's how it's used here. Let's take a look. Let's reread what he said. There are expressions, you see, Master Copperfield, Latin words and terms in Mr. Tidd that are trying to a reader of my humble attainments, that are very difficult for someone who is so simple like me. So I'm studying law, but there are so many Latin words and Latin phrases that you have to learn, and it's very difficult because I'm so simple. Would you like to be taught Latin? I said briskly. I will teach it to you with pleasure as I learn it. Oh, thank you, Master Copperfield, he answered, shaking his head. I'm sure it's very kind of you to make the offer, but I'm much too humble to accept it. Isn't that annoying? What nonsense, Uriah. Oh, indeed, you must excuse me, Master Copperfield. I am greatly obliged, and I should like it of all things, I assure you, but I'm far too humble. There are people enough to tread upon me in my lowly state without my doing outrage to their feelings by possessing learning. So he's actually saying that he wouldn't like to learn something he wouldn't like to offend better people than himself by knowing too much. Learning ain't for me. I lost my place. Uh-oh. Yeah. Learning ain't for me. A person like me had better not aspire. Aspire means to hope for better things, to hope for greater things. So he's saying a person like myself, such a low person, shouldn't hope for bigger things or shouldn't hope for better things, shouldn't try to be too great. If he is to get on in life, he must go on humbly, Master Copperfield. So he's saying, if I want to be happy in life, I should be humble and not try to be too great or try to be too much. I never saw his mouth so wide, or the creases in his cheeks so deep, as when he delivered himself of these sentiments, shaking his head all the time and writhing like a snake, writhing modestly. I think you're wrong, Uriah, I said. I dare say there are several things that I could teach you if you would like to learn them. Oh, I don't doubt that, Master Copperfield, he answered. Not in the least. But not being humble yourself, you don't judge well, perhaps, for them that are. I won't provoke my betters with knowledge, thank you. I'm much too humble. Here is my humble dwelling, Master Copperfield. So Davy says, I think you're wrong. I can teach you some Latin. It's fine. It's no big deal. And Uriah says, no, you don't understand because you're from like a different class of people. You don't understand what it would be like if I had certain knowledge that if higher people heard me using it, they would be offended that I would be so smart in my low station. And then he says, here is my humble dwelling, Master Copperfield. We've got Hadi is here. He says, put up a paling around your house to guard some privacy. That was a while ago. I just see this message now. But honestly, Hadi, nobody will say paling. I've never heard anybody ever say that. You would just say fence. Maybe somebody somewhere says it, but I've never heard it. I think it's either a technical term or it's a very old term, because this story I think is like 170 years old. So maybe it's just something that they used a long time ago. We entered a low, old-fashioned room, walked straight in front of the street, and found there Mrs. Heap, who was a dead image of Uriah, only shorter. You know, that's kind of an interesting expression. It's used quite a bit. I'm going to put that up here, dead. Now, I know that you know the word dead if you're watching this. But like, for example, dead tired means like absolutely tired. So this is kind of an interesting way of using dead. I think it's used more in the UK than it is in other places. Like maybe everybody would say, I'm dead tired. That's like an expression. But I think other words like I'm dead hungry, that's like I'm extremely hungry. I don't know if you would hear that outside of the UK or outside of England, to be dead tired. But that's kind of interesting, using the word dead in this way. And here, how did they use it here? We entered the low, old-fashioned room, walked straight into from the street, and found there Mrs. Heap, who was a dead image of Uriah, only short. So the mother looked exactly like Uriah, only she was shorter. Hadi says super tired. Yeah, that would be more normal. Super tired. You could say I'm super tired, I'm super hungry. But you could say dead. That you could use dead for that. Super you probably knew, but did you know that dead could be used that way? Okay, let's see. She received me with the utmost humility and apologized to me for giving her son a kiss, observing that as lowly as they were, they had their natural affections, which they hoped would give no offense to anyone. It was a perfectly decent room, half parlor and half kitchen, but not at all snug. Snug means comfortable. Snug means like warm and comfortable. Wait, let's see. What is the official definition of snug? That's a good word too. I'm going to put that up. Yeah, comfortable, warm, cozy, snug. As snug as a bug in a rug. I'm going to put snug up here. That's a good word. Snug. So that means like warm and comfortable, a very nice feeling. So Davy is saying, well, I entered the house. It's not bad. It's not a bad place. Everything seems okay, but it isn't snug. It doesn't feel comfortable. It doesn't feel warm like a home. Let's see. It was a perfectly decent room, half parlor, that's like a living room, parlor, and half kitchen. But not at all snug. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't warm. There was no warmth in that room. The tea things were set upon the table, and the kettle was boiling on the hob. There was a chest of drawers with an escritoire top for Uriah to read or write of an evening. There was Uriah's blue bag lying down and vomiting papers. Oh, there was a blue bag lying down and vomiting papers. Okay, I get it. So there's a blue bag, and it's vomiting papers. There was a company of Uriah's books, commanded by Mr. Tidd. There was a corner cupboard. And there were the unusual articles of furniture. I don't remember that any individual object had a bare, pinched, spare look. But I do remember that the whole place had. So he's saying, I don't remember any empty areas. There seemed to be things everywhere. There were things everywhere. But somehow, when you looked at the room, it seemed empty. So it's more of a feeling than it is that there's nothing in the room. There's something empty about being in that room. It was perhaps a part of Mrs. Heep's humility that she still wore weeds. I don't know what that is. Weeds. I guess it's some kind of some part of what you would wear, like part of your dress, but I don't know what it means here. Wait, let me see. Wearing weeds. Victorian. Oh, the term widow weeds refer to black clothing. Oh, okay. Now I know what it means. Well, I'm glad I looked that up. If you're a widow, meaning your husband died, after that time, most women of that time would always just dress in black. Like this. And these were called widow weeds. I didn't know that. Okay. So Uriah's mother was dressed like that. She was dressed all in black because the father was dead. The husband was dead. So it was perhaps part of Mrs. Heep's humility that she still wore weeds, notwithstanding the lapse of time that had occurred since Mr. Heep's decease. So maybe the husband had been dead for many, many years, but she still dressed in that way. She still wore weeds. I think there was some compromise in the cap. But otherwise, she was as weedy as in the early days of her mourning. So maybe she wore like a little bit nicer hat, a little bit more decorative. But besides that, she still looked like a widow. and like her husband just died. "This is a day to be remembered, my Uriah, I'm sure," said Mrs. Heep, making tea, "when Master Copperfield pays us a visit." I said you'd think so, Mother," said Uriah. "If I could have wished Father to remain among us for any reason," said Mrs. Heep, "it would have been that he might have known his company this afternoon." So this is very ridiculous. The mother is saying, "I wish your father was still alive so that he could have the honor of David Copperfield's visit to the house." This is just a 10-year-old boy. They're really going crazy with this. I felt embarrassed by these compliments, but I was sensible, too, of being entertained as an honored guest. So he was very embarrassed, but he kind of enjoyed it, too. It sort of enjoyed it also. And I thought Mrs. Heep an agreeable woman. So Mrs. Heep was very nice. She was friendly, a little weird. She was a little bit weird, like Uriah, but he liked her. "My Uriah," said Mrs. Heep, "has looked forward to this, sir, a long while. He had his fears that our umbleness stood in the way, and I joined in them myself. Humble we are, humble we have been, humble we shall ever be," said Mrs. Heep. So she's saying Uriah has hoped so much that one day you would come and have tea with us in our home. But we were both afraid you would never do it because we're so humble. We're so humble. We're so simple and poor. We never thought that you would do this. "I'm sure you have no occasion to be so, ma'am," I said, "unless you like." "Thank you, sir," retorted Mrs. Heep. "We know our station and are thankful in it." I found that Mrs. Heep gradually got nearer to me, and that Uriah gradually got opposite to me, and that they respectfully plied me with the choicest of the eatables on the table, and there was nothing particularly choice there, to be sure, but I took the will for the deed, and felt that they were very attentive. Presently they began to talk about aunts, and then I told them about mine, and about fathers and mothers, and then I told them about mine, and then Mrs. Heep began to talk about fathers-in-law, and then I began to tell her about mine, but stopped, because my aunt had advised me to observe a silence on that subject. A tender young cork, however, would have no more chance against a pair of corkscrews, or a tender young tooth against a pair of dentists, or a little shuttlecock against two battledores. Okay, I don't know what a shuttlecock or a battledore is. Let's check. Shuttlecock. Oh, I know what that is. We just call it something different. Let me show you what a shuttlecock is. Wait, wrong one. I would call this a birdie. But I guess maybe in the UK they call it a shuttlecock. I've never heard that before, but I would call that a birdie. And let's see what was the other word that she used? Shuttlecock and battledores. Well, let's see what a battledore is. Oh, okay. I guess this is just a primitive version of a game called badminton. Yeah, badminton. So I guess the paddles are battledores. Not that it's important. I don't think you'll ever use that. I don't know if it's still in use now because these are very old drawings. But I guess it's good to know. Okay, let's keep going. A tender young. I'm not sure what the point of this is, but we'll hopefully there'll be a point coming here soon. A tender young cork, however, would have no more chance against a pair of corkscrews. A tender young tooth against a pair of dentists, or a little shuttlecock against two battledores, than I had against Uriah and Mrs. Heep. So Davy felt like the tender cork, and Uriah and the mother were the corkscrews. Or Davy felt like the sensitive tooth, and Uriah and the mother were the dentists. Or Davy felt like the, what was it called? A shuttlecock? Shuttlecock? Davy felt like the shuttlecock, and Uriah and the mother were the battledores. They did just what they liked with me, and wormed things out of me that I had no desire to tell. To worm something. I'm going to put that. To worm something out of someone. That's a good one. To worm something out of someone. That means somebody doesn't want to talk, but somehow you manage to make them say it. That's so hard to see. I'm going to have to do something. I don't know if you can see that very clearly. I'm going to have to change the format of this. To worm something out of someone is to try to make someone tell you something that they don't want to tell you. I'll make a little video about that, like how to use that in a sentence. Wait, this is like number 6, I think. I don't know why I said number 1. Okay, let's take this off. Okay, Stella Maris says, peace. Okay, peace, Stella. All right, let's see. They did just what they liked with me, and wormed things out of me I had no desire to tell. With a certainty I blush to think of, the more especially as in my juvenile frankness. To be frank means to tell the truth without being afraid, not being afraid to be honest. Hadi, if you're still watching, do you remember the other word that we were talking about that was like frank from the other day? That was like 2 or 3 days ago. I'll be very impressed if you can remember that word. So juvenile frankness juvenile means young. So, younger children are more honest. They don't care about feelings as much as other people. So that's juvenile frankness. Okay, I took some credit to myself for being so confidential and felt that I was quite the patron of my 2 respectful entertainers. They were very fond of one another, that was certain. I take it, that had its effect upon me, as a touch of nature, but the skill with which the one followed up with whatever the other said was a touch of art which I was still less proof against. So Davy could see that they had a very close relationship, and he was pretty surprised at how they acted like a team. One person would say something, and the other person would say something. It's like they worked together. When there was nothing more to be got out of myself, for on the Murdstone and Grimby life and on my journey, I was dumb. Dumb here, you probably, if you know the word dumb, you probably know it meaning stupid. Dumb and stupid are synonyms. But also dumb means silent. Like not talking. So when he says, talking about Murdstone and Grimby life, that's when he was living in London and he was being abused. And what was the other thing? And on my journey, I was dumb. He would not talk about his time in London or when he walked from London to his aunt in Dover. He would not talk about that. That's why he says, I was dumb. It doesn't mean I was stupid. It means I didn't talk. I didn't say anything. They began about Mr. Wickfield and Agnes. Uriah threw the ball to Mrs. Heep. So they're a team. Uriah threw the ball to Mrs. Heep. Mrs. Heep caught it and threw it back to Uriah. Uriah kept it up a little while, and then sent it back to Mrs. Heep. So they went on, tossing it. Tossing is like throwing. Tossing it about, until I had no idea who had got it, and was quite bewildered. Bewildered means confused. Maybe that could be a word that we could use here. I've been neglecting my vocabulary list. Bewildered, that's a good word. That means confused. Very confused, actually. Bewildered. And so they went on, tossing it about, until I had no idea who had got it, and was quite bewildered. I was very confused. So Uriah and the mother kept talking back and forth, gossiping, and it was kind of driving Davy a little bit crazy. Now it was Mr. Wickfield, now Agnes, now the excellence of Mr. Wickfield, now my admiration of Agnes. Now the extent of Mr. Wickfield's business and resources, now our domestic life after dinner, now the wine that Mr. Wickfield took, the reason why he took it. Mr. Wickfield drank a lot of alcohol, so they were gossiping about him being an alcoholic. And why. And the pity that it was that he took so much. Now one thing, now another, then everything at once, and all the time, without appearing to speak very often, or do anything but sometimes encourage them a little, for fear that they should be overcome by their humility and honor of my company. So Davy was even afraid to talk, because every time he would talk, they would say, "Oh, we're so grateful that you talk to us, because we're so humble. We're so humble." I found myself perpetually letting out something or other that I had no business to let out, and seeing the effect of it in the twinkling of Uriah's dinted nostrils. So Davy actually, he got involved in the gossip, and he started saying things that he shouldn't have said, because he enjoyed seeing the shocked interest that Uriah and his mother would have when he would give them some information. I had begun a little uncomfortable, and to wish myself well out of the visit, when a figure coming down the street passed the door. It stood open to air the room, which was warm, the weather being close for the time of year. Came back again, looked in, and walked in, exclaiming loudly, "Copperfield! Is it possible?" So Davy was very uncomfortable in this situation, obviously, and he wanted to leave. And the Heaps left the door to the house open because it was very hot. That night was very hot. So people walking by could see inside the house. And one stranger walked by the house, and then he came back and looked in the door and said, "David Copperfield, is that you?" It was Mr. Micawber. It was Mr. Micawber, with his eyeglass, and with his walking stick, and with his shirt collar, and his genteel ear, and the condescending roll in his voice, all complete. My dear, well, I don't know if you haven't followed the other chapters. When Davy was living in London, his father-in-law sent him to work in a factory. It was very miserable, and he didn't have a place to stay. But the people at the factory found him a room to rent, And this was with a family, the Micawbers, and and they became very good friends while he was living in London. And the reason he decided to run away from London was because the Micawbers had left London and he was all alone and scared. And that's why he went to Dover to see his aunt. Plus, it was miserable and horrible. But after the Micawbers left, he was very sad. So it was Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber with his eyeglass and his walking stick and his shirt collar and his genteel ear and the condescending roll in his voice, all complete. "My dear Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber, putting out his hand, "this is indeed a meeting which is calculated to impress the mind with a sense of the instability and uncertainty of all human. In short, it is the most extraordinary meeting. Walking alone, by the way, don't get scared with this crazy language. This is how Mr. Micawber talks. He talks in a ridiculous way, using many words, many big words. It's annoying, but it's part of his personality. And I don't think anybody likes it. I think people laugh at him because of the way he talks. And even for a native speaker, it's very difficult to understand what he's saying. All he's really saying is, "I can't believe it's you." But he says it in a very annoying, indirect way. But that's his personality. That's who Mr. Micawber is. And he always summarizes what he says. "In short, it is a most extraordinary meeting." So walking along the street, reflecting upon the probability of something turning up, of which I am at present rather sanguine, I find a young but valued friend turn up, who is connected with the most eventful period of my life. I may say, with the turning point of my existence, Copperfield, my dear fellow, how do you do? So after all of that annoying speech, he says, "How are you?" That's all he had to say in the beginning. "I can't believe it's you. How are you?" That's what a normal person would do. But Mr. Micawber goes into this crazy speech. I really cannot say that I was glad to see Mr. Micawber there. But I was glad to see him too, and shook hands with him heartily, inquiring how Mrs. Micawber was doing. So actually, Davy is saying, I wasn't exactly happy to see him, but it was okay. It was okay to see him. That's kind of interesting. "Thank you," said Mr. Micawber, waving his hand, as of old, and settling his chin in his shirt collar. "She is tolerably convalescent. The twins no longer derive their sustenance from nature's founts. In short," said Mr. Micawber, in one of his bursts of confidence, "they are weaned, and Mrs. Micawber is at present my traveling companion. She will be rejoiced, Copperfield, to renew her acquaintance with you, one who has proved himself in all respects a worthy minister at the sacred altar of friendship." So let's translate that into regular English. How is Mr. Micawber? How is Mrs. Micawber? "Oh, she's great. The twins are bigger. Our two children, our two babies, are bigger now, so she doesn't have to take care of them as much, and she will be so very happy to see you." That's what he's saying, but he's saying it in a very ridiculous way. "I said I should be delighted to see her." "You're very good," said Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber then smiled and settled his chin again and looked about him. "I have discovered, my friend Copperfield," said Mr. Micawber genteelly, and without addressing himself particularly to anyone, "not in solitude, but partaking of a social meal in company with a widow lady, and one who is apparently her offspring. In short," said Mr. Micawber in another of his bursts of confidence, "her son. I shall esteem it an honor to be presented. So let's translate that into normal English. He's saying, "Oh, but you're not alone. You're with this woman and I guess her son. Can you please introduce me?" I could do no less under these circumstances than make Mr. Micawber known to. Oh, this is why I think Davy was unhappy to see Mr. Micawber, because they were good friends. He didn't he didn't want that. He was avoiding talking about that period of his life to the Heaps because he doesn't trust them. And he's not supposed to tell people about that period in his life. But then suddenly Mr. Micawber comes in, and how can he explain how he knows this man? I mean, he was renting a room from this man while he was being a slave in a factory in London. It's a pretty pathetic time, a pretty embarrassing time in his life, and to give the Heaps that kind of information is horrible. But now he has no choice. He has to introduce Mr. Micawber to the Heaps, and of course they're going to ask, "Oh, how do you know him?" I could do no less under these circumstances than make Mr. Micawber known to Uriah Heep and his mother, which I accordingly did. As they abased themselves before him, Mr. Micawber took a seat, and waved his hand in his courtly manner. "Any friend of Copperfield's," said Mr. Micawber, "has a personal claim upon myself. Any friend of Copperfield's is a friend of mine." "We are too humble, sir," said Mrs. Heep, "my son and me, to be friends of Master Copperfield." So they're saying we're too simple and poor to be friends of Mr. Copperfield. "He has been so good as to take his tea with us, and we are thankful to him for his company, also to you, sir, for your notice." "Ma'am," returned Mr. Micawber with a bow, "you are very obliging. And what are you doing, Copperfield? Still in the wine trade?" So he was working at this wine factory in London. And Mr. Micawber makes it sound very glamorous. "Are you still in the wine business?" I was excessively anxious to get Mr. Micawber away, and replied with my hat in my hand and very red face, "I have no doubt that I was a pupil at Dr. Strong's." "A pupil?" said Mr. Micawber, raising his eyebrows. "I'm extremely happy to hear it, although a mind like my friend Copperfield's," to Uriah and Mrs. Heep, "does not require the cultivation which, without his knowledge of men and things, it would require. Still, it is a rich soil, teeming with latent vegetation. In short," said Mr. Micawber, smiling in another burst of confidence, "it is an intellect capable of getting up the classics to any extent." Okay, I'm not even sure what he's saying there, but I think he's saying, oh, David doesn't really need to go to school. He's already very smart and educated. Uriah, with his long hands slowly twining over one another, made a ghastly writhe from the waist upwards to express his concurrence with the estimation of me. "Shall we go and see Mrs. Micawber, sir?" I said, to get Mr. Micawber away. "If you will do her that favor, Copperfield," replied Mr. Micawber, rising. "I have no scruple in saying, in the presence of our friends here, that I am a man who has for some years contended against the pressure of pecuniary difficulties." Pecuniary. Let's look that up. Pecuniary. Relating to or consisting of money. Let's see. "I am a man who has for some years contended against the pressure of pecuniary difficulties." They're always, the Micawbers are always in financial trouble. That's why they had to leave London. And when they were in London, Mr. Micawber was in jail for a long time because he owed money that he couldn't pay. So they're always in financial trouble, the Micawbers. That's why they took Davy. That's why they rented a room to Davy to make some money. I knew he was certain to say something of this kind. He always would be so boastful about his difficulties. So I don't quite understand what he's saying, but I think he's saying, I'm in financial trouble again. And Davy was saying, oh, I knew that he was going to do this because he's not ashamed of it. He doesn't care. He tells people about it. I knew that he was going to say something of this kind. He always would be so boastful about his difficulties. Sometimes I have risen superior to my difficulties. Sometimes my difficulties have, in short, have floored me. There have been times when I have administered a succession of facers to them. There have been times when they have been too many for me. So he's saying, sometimes I have these financial difficulties and I can succeed. I can pay everybody off and there's no problem. But sometimes it's just too much and I can't. And I have given in and said to Mrs. Micawber in the words of Cato, Plato, thou reasonest well, it's all up now. I can show fight no more. But at no time of my life, said Mr. Micawber, have I enjoyed a higher degree of satisfaction than in pouring my griefs. If I may describe difficulties chiefly arising out of warrants of attorney and promissory notes at 2 and 4 months, by that word, into the bosom of my friend Copperfield. So Mr. Micawber, Davy's just a little 10-year-old boy. But Mr. Micawber is saying, a great happiness of mine is to be able to share with you my financial problems. Not share like financially, but to share them with you, to tell you about them. Mr. Micawber closed this handsome tribute by saying, Mr. Heep, good evening. Mrs. Heep, your servant. And then walking out with me in his most fashionable manner, making a good deal of noise on the pavement with his shoes, and humming a tune as we went. Okay, I'm just going to take a little 1-minute break, and I will be back in a minute if I can find... Okay. All right, I'll be back in 1 minute. I just have to take a break. Okay, we're back. Let's see, where did we leave off? It was a little inn where Mr. Micawber put up, and he occupied a little room in it, partitioned off from the commercial room, and strongly flavored with tobacco smoke. I think it was over the kitchen, because a warm, greasy smell appeared to come up through the chinks in the floor, and there was a flabby perspiration on the walls. I know it was near the bar on account of the smell of spirits. Spirits is another way of saying alcohol. And the jingling of glasses. Imagine two glasses hitting each other. That's like jingling. Here recumbent on a small sofa, underneath, a picture of a racehorse, with her head close to the fire, and her feet pushing the mustard off the dumbwaiter. At the other end of the room was Mrs. Micawber, to whom Mr. Micawber entered first, saying, "My dear, allow me to introduce to you a pupil of Dr. Strong's." I noticed, by the by, that although Mr. Micawber was just as much confused as ever about my age and standing, he always remembered as a genteel thing that I was a pupil of Dr. Strong's. Mrs. Micawber was amazed, but very glad to see me. I was very glad to see her too, and after an affectionate greeting on both sides, sat down on the small sofa near her. "My dear," said Mr. Micawber, "if you will mention to Copperfield what our present position is, which I have no doubt he will like to know, I will go and look at the paper the while, and see whether anything turns up among the advertisements." "I thought you were at Plymouth, ma'am," I said to Mrs. Micawber as he went out. So when they were leaving London, they were headed to Plymouth. And I think, if I remember correctly, Mrs. Micawber had some relatives in Plymouth, and they were supposed to help find Mr. Micawber some work. "My dear Master Copperfield," she replied, "we went to Plymouth. To be on the spot." "To be on the spot?" I hinted. I don't know what that means, to be on the spot. "Just so," said Mrs. Micawber. "To be on the spot. But the truth is, talent is not wanted in the custom house. The local influence of my family was quite unavailing to obtain any employment in that department. For no man of Mr. Micawber's abilities. They would rather not have a man of Mr. Micawber's abilities. He would only show the deficiency of others." So they went to Plymouth, and she tried to use her family's connections to get him a job, a nice job, but they didn't want him. And Mrs. Micawber is saying, well, the reason that they didn't want him was because he's too good for them. He would make them all look bad because he's so smart and talented. "Apart from which," said Mrs. Micawber, "I will not disguise from you, my dear Master Copperfield, that when the branch of my family which is settled in Plymouth became aware of Mr. Micawber, was accompanied by myself, and by my little Wilkins and his sister, and by the twins, they did not receive him with that ardor." Every time I scroll, I lose my place. I have to find it again. Or maybe I went too far. No. "They did not receive him with that ardor which might have been expected, being so newly released from captivity. In fact," said Mrs. Micawber, lowering her voice, "this is between ourselves. Our reception was cool." So they went to Plymouth hoping that Mrs. Micawber's family would help him find a job. And they just were released from prison. But when they arrived, her family really didn't want to see them. Maybe they were embarrassed because they're poor, or because they just came from jail, but they didn't really want them around. "Dear me," I said. "Yes," said Mrs. Micawber. "It is truly painful to contemplate mankind in such an aspect, Master Copperfield, but our reception was decidedly cool." So that means they didn't want us around. They were not happy to see us. "There's no doubt about it. In fact, that branch of my family which is settled in Plymouth became quite personal to Mr. Micawber before we had been there a week." I said and thought that they ought to be ashamed of themselves. So I guess they insulted him. Maybe she'll say what they did. "Still, so it was," continued Mrs. Micawber. "Under such circumstances, what could a man of Mr. Micawber's spirit do? But one obvious course was left: to borrow of that branch of my family the money to return to London, and return at any sacrifice." "Then you all came back again, ma'am?" I said. "Well, we all came back again. We all came back again," replied Mrs. Micawber. "Since then, I have consulted other branches of my family." So, in the end, because they couldn't find work in Plymouth, Mrs. Micawber asked her family for some money, and I think they happily gave it to her to make her go away. And then they returned to London. "I have consulted other branches of my family, on the course of which it is most expedient for Mr. Micawber to take. For I maintain that he must take some course, Master Copperfield," said Mrs. Micawber argumentatively. "It is clear that a family of 6, not including a domestic, cannot live upon air." "Certainly, ma'am," I said. "The opinion of those other branches of my family," pursued Mrs. Micawber, "is that Mr. Micawber should immediately turn his attention to coals." "To what, ma'am?" "To coals," said Mrs. Micawber. "To the coal trade. Trade means business." Mr. Micawber was induced to think on inquiry that there might be an opening for a man of his talent in the Medway coal trade. Then, as Mr. Micawber very properly said, the first step to be taken clearly was to come and see the Medway, which we came and saw. I say we, Master Copperfield, for I never will, said Mrs. Micawber with emotion. "I never will desert Mr. Micawber." She's always doing that. Mr. Micawber is always getting into trouble, getting in jail, getting in debt. And Mrs. Micawber says, "I will never leave him," and she starts crying. She always does that. She's doing that here. "I will never desert." Desert means leave or abandon. "I will never desert Mr. Micawber." I murmured my admiration and approbation. "We came," repeated Mrs. Micawber, "and we saw the Medway. My opinion of the coal trade on that river is that it may require talent, but that it certainly requires capital. Talent Mr. Micawber has. Capital means money here. Money Mr. Micawber has not. We saw, I think, the greater part of the Medway, and that is my individual conclusion. Being so near, Mr. Micawber was of opinion that it would be rash not to come on and see the cathedral. Firstly, on account of its being so well worth seeing, and our never having seen it, and secondly, on account of the great probability of something turning up. If something turns up, that means something appears. So if you say something will turn up, that means something will come from the sky. We will get lucky. We will be lucky. Some kind of luck will happen. And Mr. Micawber is always talking about something turning up. Something will fall from the sky and help us. We will get lucky. Something turning up in a cathedral town. We've been here, said Mrs. Micawber, 3 days. Nothing, as yet, has turned up, and it may not surprise you, my dear Master Copperfield, so much as it would a stranger to know that we are at present waiting for a remittance from London to discharge our pecuniary obligations at this hotel. So she's saying that they've been staying in the hotel for 3 days and they don't have any money, and they're waiting for someone in London to send them some money to pay for the hotel. They never have any money, and they're always spending money. Until the arrival of the remittance, said Mrs. Micawber with much feeling, I am cut off from my home. I allude to lodgings in Pentonville, from my boy and girl, and from my twins. So she can't see her babies. They're staying in the hotel by themselves, and I guess I don't know what the reference is to Pentonville, but that's where her children are. Maybe she has family there. I don't know. I felt the utmost sympathy for Mr. and Mrs. Micawber in this anxious extremity, and said as much to Mr. Micawber, who now returned, adding that I only wished I had money enough to lend them the amount they needed. Mr. Micawber's answer expressed the disturbance of his mind. He said, shaking hands with me, Miss Copperfield, you are a true friend, but when the worst comes to worst, no man is without a friend who is possessed of shaving materials. At this dreadful hint, Mrs. Micawber threw her arms around Mr. Micawber's neck and entreated him to be calm. He wept, but so far recovered almost immediately as to ring a bell for the waiter and bespeak a hot kidney pudding and a plate of shrimps for breakfast in the morning. So they never have money, but they're always spending money. They have a servant, and they're always spending money on pretty fancy food. So they just, whenever they find money, they don't know how to save it. They always spend it in crazy ways. When I took my leave of them, that means when I was ready to say goodbye, they both pressed me so much to come and dine before they went away that I could not refuse. But as I knew I could not come next day, when I should have a good deal to prepare in the evening, Mr. Micawber arranged that he would call Dr. Strong's in the course of the morning, having a presentiment that the remittance would arrive by that post, and propose the day after, if it would suit me better. Accordingly, I was called out of school next forenoon, and found Mr. Micawber in the parlor, who had called to say that the dinner would take place as proposed. When I asked him if the remittance had come, he pressed my hand and departed. So they were waiting for money, and Davy, when they did meet, Davy asked him about the money, and Mr. Micawber just kind of grabbed his hand and didn't say anything, and then he left, which I guess we can assume means he didn't get the money. As I was looking out the window that same evening, it surprised me and made me rather uneasy to see Mr. Micawber and Uriah Heep walk past arm in arm. Uriah humbly sensible of the honor that was done him, and Mr. Micawber taking a bland delight in extending his patronage to Uriah. So Davy sees Uriah Heep and Mr. Micawber walking down the street, and Uriah is acting very humble, and Mr. Micawber loves that. He's really enjoying that. But I was still more surprised when I went to the little hotel the next day at the appointed dinner hour, which was 4 o'clock, to find from what Mr. Micawber said that he had gone home with Uriah and had drunk brandy and water at Mrs. Heep's. And I'll tell you what, my dear Copperfield, said Mr. Micawber, your friend Heep is a young fellow who might be Attorney General, If I had known that young man at the period when my difficulties came to a crisis, all I can say is that I believe my creditors would have been a great deal better managed than they were. So Mr. Micawber is saying, if I had known Uriah Heep when I was really in trouble with the law, he would have helped me more than the lawyer that I had. I hardly understood how this could have been, seeing that Mr. Micawber had paid them nothing at all, as it was, but I did not like to ask. Neither did I like to say that I hoped he had not been too communicative with Uriah. So Davy is hoping that Mr. Micawber didn't tell Uriah about Davy's shameful life in London, or to inquire if they had talked much about me, but he was afraid to ask about that. I was afraid of hurting Mr. Micawber's feelings, or at all events, Mrs. Micawber's. She being very sensitive, but I was uncomfortable about it too, and often thought about it afterwards. We had a beautiful dinner, quite an elegant dish of fish and kidney and of loin of veal, roasted, fried sausage meat, a partridge, and a pudding, and there was wine, and there was a strong ale, and after dinner Mrs. Micawber made us a bowl of hot punch with her own hands. Mrs. Micawber was uncommonly convivial. I never saw Mr. Micawber. Mr. Micawber was uncommonly convivial. I never saw such a good company. He made his face shine with the punch, so that it looked as if it had been varnished all over. He got cheerfully sentimental about the town and the proposed success to it, observing that Mrs. Micawber and himself had been made extremely snug. Remember that word snug means like comfortable, warm and comfortable, cozy. That's another word. And and that he should never forget the agreeable hours they had passed in Canterbury. He proposed to me afterwards, and he and Mrs. Micawber and I took a review of our past acquaintance, in the course of which we sold the property all over again. And then I proposed Mrs. Micawber, or at least said modestly, "If you'll allow me, Mrs. Micawber, I shall now have the pleasure of drinking your health, ma'am." On which Mr. Micawber delivered the word is eulogium. Okay, eulogium. I think that just means speech. I think that's Greek for speech. But let's see, eulogium. A formal expression of praise for someone who has died. Yeah, I thought it was from the word eulogy. A eulogy is something that you say when somebody is dead at the funeral or at the wake. You say eulogy. You say nice things about them. But why are they using that here? Because that's the only definition of eulogium. On Mrs. Micawber's character. I'm not sure why they're using it here. Okay, well, it doesn't matter. It's not a common word. It's not something that you have to use in regular speech, ever. You'll never use that word in your life, I guarantee it. And said she had ever been his guide, philosopher, and friend, and that he would recommend me when I came to a marrying time in life, to marry such another woman, if such another woman could be found. As the punch disappeared, Mr. Micawber became still more friendly and convivial. Mrs. Micawber's spirits becoming elevated too, we sang Old Lang Syne. When we came to Here's a Hand, My Trusty Frere, we all joined hands round the table, and when we declared that we would take a right good Willie Watt, and hadn't the least idea what it meant, we were really affected. In a word, I never saw anybody so thoroughly jovial. Jovial means like happy, having fun, as Mr. Micawber was, down to the very last moment of the evening, when I took a hearty farewell of himself and his amiable wife. Amiable means friendly. Consequently, I was not prepared at 7 o'clock next morning to receive the following communication, dated 9:30 in the evening, a quarter of an hour after I left him. My dear young friend, the die is cast. All is over. When you say the die is cast, that means nothing can be done. There's nothing you can do. So this sounds like something bad. When somebody starts a sentence with the die, or somebody starts a speech or a letter with the die is cast, that's bad, because that means there's nothing that can be done. We can't change this. So let's see what Mr. Micawber said in the letter. My dear young friend, the die is cast. All is over. Hiding the ravages of care with a sickly mask of mirth. So let's translate the Mr. Micawber language. So we were actually very sad last night, but we were hiding it with happiness. I have not informed you this evening that there is no hope of a remittance under these circumstances, alike humiliating to endure, humiliating to contemplate, and humiliating to relate. I have discharged the pecuniary liability contracted at this establishment by giving a note of hand, made payable 14 days after date, at my residence, Pentonville, London. So what he's saying is, we didn't have enough money to pay for the hotel, so I wrote a note saying, I will owe you the money. I have to give you the money. I think they're just escaping from the hotel, but they wrote a note saying, we live in London. This is my address. We will pay you one day. That's what he's saying. At least he's not just leaving. At least he's leaving a note. When it becomes due, I will not be taken up. The result is destruction. The bolt is impending. The tree must fall. Let the wretched man who now addresses you, my dear Copperfield, be a beacon to you through your life. He writes with that intention and in that hope. If he could think of himself of so much use, one gleam of day might by possibility penetrate into the cheerless dungeon of his remaining existence, though his longevity is at present, to say the least of it, extremely problematical. This is the last communication, my dear Copperfield, you will ever receive from the beggared outcast, Wilkins Micawber. Okay, how do we translate that? He wants to say, if he could be anything to Davy, it should be an example. Like Davy should learn from him how not to behave. That's what he's saying in that last paragraph. And don't worry if you don't understand it, because it's very complicated, even for a native speaker, to read that. It doesn't make any sense. It's very complicated. But that's what he's saying. He's saying, I hope that you will learn from my mistakes. And then he says, this will be the last time you hear from me. I was so shocked by the contents of this heart-rending letter that I ran off directly towards the little hotel with the intention of taking it on my way to Dr. Strong's and trying to soothe Mr. Micawber with a word of comfort. To soothe. Soothe is a verb. Actually, I'm going to put that word up here. Soothe. I don't know. I'm just going to guess that we're at word number 10 here. Soothe. Soothe is a word that means make relax. So if you listen to soothing music, that's music that makes you feel relaxed. Or if you say soothing words to someone, they're words that make them feel relaxed. And Davy is saying, I ran to the hotel to soothe Mr. Micawber. I wanted to make him feel better, because Davy knew that he was feeling very depressed and sad. So he went to the hotel to soothe Mr. Micawber. All right. Trying to soothe Mr. Micawber with a word of comfort, but halfway there I met the London coach with Mr. and Mrs. Micawber up behind it. Mr. Micawber was the very picture of tranquil enjoyment, smiling at Mrs. Micawber's conversation, eating walnuts out of a paper bag. So Davy's running to the hotel, very worried about Mr. Micawber, and he wanted to soothe him, make him feel better. And as he's running, he sees the coach. That's like a bus from 200 years ago, a bus with horses. And he sees the coach moving past, passes him as he's in the street, and he sees them on the coach. And Mr. Micawber is very happy. He's eating his walnuts and listening to Mrs. Micawber talk, with a bottle sticking out of his breast. He even had some alcohol. As they did not see me, I thought it best, all things considered, not to see them. So he didn't say anything. He just let the coach pass without mentioning. So with a great weight taken off my mind, he feels better to see them happy. I turned into a by street. I went to a small street. And with a great weight taken off my mind, I turned into a by street that was nearest the way to school, and felt upon the whole relieved that they were gone, though I still liked them very much, nevertheless. All right, well, that is the end of chapter 17 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. Thank you, everybody who stayed and watched. And we will do chapter 18, a retrospect, very soon. Until then, I will see you later. Goodbye.